we're going to assemble this lovely, fully functional 2-speed transmission. So let's start with a tour of the parts. The first thing you should do when you get this kit is spread out all the parts in a place where you're not going to lose them and separate them by type. So organized by size and diameter and things like that, so that we'll be able to identify the correct ones. So first we have this group of screws that are all the same. These are the 1/2-inch screws. Then we have a whole bunch of nuts. And we have one nut that's different. This is a lock nut, so that will come later. And then we have 2 tiny little screws and tiny little nuts. Those are separate. And here we have 4 different lengths of screw that are all longer than these guys. There's a very long one and 3 separate lengths. We'll be addressing these each one at a time. And an extra long shaft that has no head on it. And then there's actually 4 thicknesses of plastic washer. These very thin, just like film thickness, very thin washers. These, which are about 3 millimeters, about 1/8 of an inch thick. These are 5 millimeters, about 1/4 of an inch, and one really thick one. And then we have these 3 square washers. They have a round hole, but a square outside diameter. And then all the other parts will come to as we get to them. So we start with the output shaft. This is the long thing with no head on it. Take that and take one of these nuts, screw it on, and then we're actually going to use 3 of these washers just as spacers to measure where this nut needs to go. So we'll take 1, 2 of the square washers and 1 of the second thinnest, the 1/8 inch or 3 millimeter washers. Put that and then screw the nut until the end of the shaft is just roughly flush with the end. It doesn't have to be exact. It can be just somewhere in that general range. And take these off. We now have the nut in the right place, so don't turn it. Turn the shaft around, and now we're going to put all 3 of these square washers on it. Actually, this one, you notice it still has a little piece of plastic inside. That's okay. Just push and it'll pop right out. So you see it's popping out. Some of them will come that way. It's just a question whether they fell out. So 1, 2, 3 square washers, and then this piece of white square tube that goes over, and you may have to force it down a little bit, but it will go over all 3 of those washers. So it's now held nicely centered. And it's intentional that the washers are a little bit longer than the tube. It's meant to stick out there. Okay, then find this piece. All the acrylic pieces, with the exception of this one, need to be peeled. But this one comes pre-peeled. So you take that, and it's got a square hole that fits on the square shaft. It should slide easily. Then again, without letting that nut turn very much, take another nut, thread it on the other end, and spin it down, and get it finger tight. And don't worry if this turns a little bit. It just needs to stay roughly where it was. Then we're going to use these 2 wrenches to tighten this. We want to get this quite tight. It's a little tricky to hold it in place, but there we go. So after it's finger tight, something like a good 1/2 a turn, even 3/4 of a turn. You want it pretty tight, because if they come loose, then your whole transmission will jam up. And this should continue to slide easily. So that completes the output shaft. Now we're going to build the shifting armature. I think it's called an armature. So all these pieces are nice and clear here, but when you get the kit, they will be covered with blue plastic film that needs to be peeled off. Everything that's not crystal clear has a film on it. These pieces here, they come with sort of a milky white film that may not be obviously a film to start with, but if it's not crystal clear, peel something off of it until it is. So, start with these guys. You notice that they have one side that's a little bit lower, goes a little bit longer down than the other side. Let's hold that one down. And then we want to take these 2 tiny screws and put them in from the back. Hold it in place with your finger. Okay, now we have them both there. And now we want to take one of these very thin pieces, shaped like that, And there's two different ways it can go. It can go this way, but if you put it this way, then you see the curvature here doesn't match the curvature here, so that's wrong. Flip it over and put it on here. So these are sort of concentric, two circles together. And then this thicker piece, 3mm piece, again, put it on there in the correct way so the curves match. And then the second very thin piece goes on there. And then the second of these, and again, match the longer side to the longer side. Put it on there, so now we have a little sandwich. And then we would take these tiny little nuts. We give you an extra one because they're very easy to lose. I find the easiest way is just sort of hold the nut in place and then use the screwdriver to tighten. And we don't want to tighten this, just sort of barely snugged up. And then the second one. And again, not quite tight. Okay, now, it's still loose, so it can still move. That's important. So now we take one of the large nuts, and we're going to slide it into the slot there. And if it's not going in, if you have to push hard, that's because it's rotated in the wrong angle. You want to have the two flats on the sides going straight down. When it's right, it'll go in. Get it right? Yes, there we go. It'll go in quite easily. You have to push a little bit, but not much. And you can use the screwdriver to push it the rest of the way. And looking down the end, push it down until you see that the hole is centered. And you can take any one of these other screws here, temporarily thread it into the nut, just as a way of checking that it's properly centered. And then take that screw back out again. So now we're ready to tighten it. So we want to set it down on a flat surface. And that will get these things aligned with each other so they're both parallel. And then we want to sort of press down this piece in the middle. It shouldn't be sticking up at all. And then you can tighten it. So you don't really need a wrench on the other side because the nuts pretty well bind. And sort of tighten it alternately a few times so that they're both evenly tight. Okay, now we have this thing. Okay, now, again, hold it with the long side down, find this piece, and hold it with the slot lower down, sort of on the lower half. And that will match up with the longer side there. It goes through there. Except that I realize we first have to get the screw. So we want to take the longest of these three intermediate screws, not the really long one, but the longest of the three similarly long screws. Take that and add a nut to it. And screw that nut halfway or so up. Okay, now we're ready for this. Take this with the long side down and the slot in the lower half. Put it together like that, and find this piece, put it on there, and then the screw goes through that piece, through the slot, and into that little nut. And now we're going to screw this in, and we don't want to screw it tight. We don't want to have the ends of the screw actually visible beyond the end of that nut. Just screw it until it's flush with the bottom of the nut, which you can see through the plastic quite clearly. And then get this sort of squared up so this piece is square to that piece, and then tighten the nut, but not the screw, which we'll do using a wrench. You can just tighten it. The screw may try to turn a little bit, and that's okay. What we're trying to not do is we don't want to apply pressure to the bottom of the plastic there and potentially crack it. So get it until it's sort of mostly tight. Then you can tighten it. Don't over tighten, but just get it tightened in there. And this should move freely like that. If it doesn't move freely, probably something is out of whack. Maybe these pieces are not square with each other. Something like that. Okay, so that is the shifting armature thing. Okay, next we're now ready to start actually assembling the main part of the transmission. So find these two pieces, they're bases. They look very similar, but they're actually slightly different. This one has a little bit wider gap here on top of the slots, and more importantly, it has an extra hole, but this one doesn't. We want the piece that has the extra hole. And because we're assembling the electrified version, of the transmission. The next step here is to attach the battery and motor assembly. This will come already connected like this. We open up the battery case and find in the electrification option there were some extra screws, including this tiny little one here. Take that one. Okay, so the battery case has a small hole in it, and you need to get this tiny little screw through that hole. So there's a trick. Put the screw on the end of the screwdriver, and then just sort of hold it in place with your finger, and use that as a way of guiding the screw into the hole and on through. Okay. Now, with this small hole on the left, we put the small screw through the small hole, if necessary, sort of push it on through with the screwdriver, and then take the tiny little nut, put it on the end of the screw, and start it, and then tighten, and then we want to tighten that down. And you want to have the bottom here sort of lined up. Okay, now you can put this back on again, and for the time being the motor is just going to sort of dangle on here. Okay, now the next step is to find these two pieces, which look quite similar, but one of them has 3 holes, one of them only has a single hole. They both have a hole on the bottom, but on the top one has 3 holes. Ignore the logo, there may or may not be a logo in your pieces. We want the one with 3 holes on top. And then identify this side has sort of an angle, a sloped piece, and this is just square. Using the side that's 2 square parts. The holes on top and that there, that matches up with the slots here on the side where the battery case is. So now we're going to do the first of many of these sort of T-slot joints. You use a nut, slide it in. If it doesn't want to go in, it's because it's not at the right angle. It should either fall through or hold just very lightly. It should not take much force to get it through. That's why I have a finger here so it doesn't fall out. And stick a screw through and tighten. And there we go. Okay, now we get the other base piece. It looks like this. This one doesn't matter which way it goes. And it goes on the other side here. And stand up and put nut through, short screw. Okay, and now we have the frame on which we're going to assemble the rest of the transmission. We start with this subassembly that we built. Take the shorter end first and get these 2 gears. These are the blue gears that have the pink parts attached to them. And we're going to take the larger of the 2 of these and slide it on there. And then, looking at the assortment of washers, we want the ones that are the 3rd thicker ones. So not the really thin washer-like ones, not the 3mm, but the 5mm, 1/4 inch thick one. One washer like that. Then hold the shaft from the other end, take the small gear, slide it on, take another 1/4 inch or 5mm washer, slide it on there. And this is now ready to go into the bottom hole there. The shaft goes in there, and you can let it sit and it will just hold itself there. So next we need to test fit this piece and decide if we need extra washers. So we slide it on the end of the shaft, bring it together, and then very gently spread these 2 apart. Don't spread it any more than necessary, and let it snap on. And now we want to test how much play is there, how much wobble back and forth. There needs to be some, but because the thickness of the acrylic is not completely consistent from batch to batch, we made it a little bit loose, and that's what these very thin washers are for. So just looking at this, I would say this needs one extra washer. So we'll take it apart and try not to have it fall, and slide the one washer on here. And then try it again. So now again, check for the play. So this is just about perfect. It wiggles a little bit, but not much. So that's good. Now we have to take this apart again. If it's still too loose, put another washer on. If it's tight at all, if it doesn't have wiggle to it, take a washer out. Okay, now we're going to assemble the top, the input shaft. So we find this long screw, the longest thing with a head on it, and these two plane gears, and take this piece, make sure it's oriented correctly with the sloped side on the same side, and put the screw in so that it will be inside. Then we take one of these 3mm washers, about 1/8 of an inch thick, slide it on, and take a nut and screw the nut on. And now we're not tightening this. We want to have play here, about 1/16 of an inch or so of play. Nice and loose, and we'll adjust it later. Then the big gear and another nut. And not tight at all, just everything is very loose. It'll get moved to the right positions later. Then another nut. The small wheel, small gear, and another nut. And these can be just, they need to be close enough together. It doesn't really matter. We'll get fixed later. And now, before we put this is almost ready to go on. Because we're doing the electrified version, we're going to add the motor mount screws, which need to be done now, because if you wait till later, it's almost impossible to get them on. So, these 3 holes, the 2 holes on the outside, not the one in the middle, are what these 2 screws that came with the motor mount kit go through. So 2 there, and a nut on the end of each one. You could have done this earlier also, at any time really. So just the last moment you could still do that. Okay, so now we have this, back to this, we've got these nuts very loose. We take another 3mm washer, stick it on there, and now making sure that none of these have fallen off, we want one thin washer, so that's good. We're now going to put this together. So the first thing that goes through is that output shaft goes through its hole, and then the input shaft goes through the hole up here on top, and we slide it together as far as it'll go. And then we need to spread this apart like we did before and slide it into place, and it will click, and there it is. So now it's all together, and now we can actually screw it together. So we put a nut and a short screw here, and a nut, and a short screw here, and now the top side plate here. So this actually can go only one way. If you try to put it on and it doesn't fit, either rotate it or flip it top to bottom, and then it will fit. now we're going to put 4 nuts in here. Again, if they don't go in easily, it's probably because they're not at the right angle. So sometimes it does require, this one requires just a little bit of pressing to get it to go in. That's okay, but not excessive force. That's probably an angle problem. And that was easy. Okay, so I got 4 nuts in place, and now 4 screws. Now we're ready to adjust the position of these nuts here, to position the gears. So we want to spin this one until there's just a bit of play. Should wobble just a little bit. Definitely needs to wobble though, should not be tight. And then holding the screw and the gear, so neither of them turn, spin that nut, this inner nut, until it's kind of snug up against there. We're not tightening it yet. And this should still wobble. And then this nut opposite, we want to spin it out until it just touches this wall here, and then back it off a half a turn or so. So again, it can wiggle back and forth some. And then holding the screw, slide this gear into place and spin this nut until it's snug up against the gear. Now they're in the right place and we can tighten them. So using the 2 wrenches, go in here. We want to turn both wrenches sort of about the same amount. Get each of these nice and tight. And then check again that this has a bit of play in it. That's perfect. So the whole thing should spin easily. If it's not spinning easily, something is spread too far or tightened too much or something. Okay. So, now, because this is the electrified version, there's no crank on this end. The crank is included in the kit in case you want to de-electrify at some point, but you're not going to use it right now. So, next we're going to attach this sort of gear cog thing that connects to the motor. Put a nut on, and you screw it almost all the way back there to start with. And then you put the coupler on and another nut. And this nut, you want to screw it on just till it's flush with the end of the screw, not so the screw doesn't stick out at all. And then pull this forward and spin the nut behind it forwards until it's snug there. And then holding both this and the gear, so neither of them turn, tighten this nut up against the thing. So these are now connected together. And then, okay, so now we're going to mount the motor. So we put 1 nut on each of these studs sticking out. And then we find this motor holding bracket and take the motor, it has its cog there already attached, and we want to slide the wires through the slot there, and then you see the motor only fits one way, so it slides in, well I guess 2 ways, it could be upside down, and slide it sort of to the back there, and then slide that on, and then put a nut on each end here. And you can now adjust the position. What we want to do is arrange it so that with the motor pulled all the way back like this, it's a little bit behind there's a little bit of separation there. And then spin these nuts out. And of course you want to have it straight, so they should both be at the same position on the end of the screw there, which is basically pretty much at the end of the screw. Then you can tighten these nuts. And you'll see that the motor can now, oh, I don't have it straight. These were not correctly positioned. You may have to fiddle this a little bit to get it at just the right angle. Okay. So now the motor can slide in and out. When it's slid all the way back, this is free to turn, but when you push it forwards, it engages. Okay, we'll slide it out for now because we need this to turn. So now we can attach the shifting mechanism. So taking this part again that we put together earlier, find the longer side. That's going to go down. So it fits in here, and these two sides go around the disc in the middle with the green gear on it. So it goes around there and fits onto its tabs there. Then put a nut. And a screw. Now we need to make the gear shift lever itself. So that's done with these parts. This is going to go here, and this will go here. But they first need to be put together. So we want to make sure that the engraving is on the top side, like that. Hold these together. Put a nut in there. Screw. There. Screw. Okay, now a little bit of a high stakes assembly step. So we find this the longest of the second longest of the longer screws. Stick it through there. Put a nut on. And tighten it. Now find the little spring, and we put the spring on, and then we have no washers. We'll come back with the right washer. Found the 3mm washer. It's back here. 3mm washer goes on top of the spring, and now here the problem is that if you let this go, the spring will launch the washer, and you really won't find it. So be sure to keep a finger on it. And if I compress it down and hold it in place with a finger, and take the gear shift lever, stick it through the slot and up and onto the screw. Now the lever will hold the spring in place, but still hold it down. And then find the one nut that's not like the other nuts. This is the lock nut. It's thicker, has sort of an extra ring, and it has a piece of plastic insert there, which binds with the thread. So you screw it on with the plastic little disc up, so it spins on easily, but then at some point it starts not wanting to turn, and that's what it's supposed to do. So then we take the wrench and just tighten this. It's going to be resisting you the whole way, but that's okay. And you want to keep tightening until this piece and this lever are basically parallel. It doesn't have to be perfect. And you see this now moves back and forth with the spring keeping the shift lever in its slot. Okay, now this can be assembled to the almost finished model. So the forks here go around the screw, and then the tabs fit into place there. And then we can put a nut on. And screw. Another nut. Short screw. And it's finished. If this for some reason doesn't fit right, you can adjust that by moving that. In fact, this needs to be adjusted a little bit out. I tightened this just a bit too far. So we'll let that come out a little bit. Okay. So now it's ready to go. And because this is the electrified version, we can engage the motor. Well, it's not going to work without batteries. So take the batteries which come with the kit and install them. Now, switch it on, and there it is. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't put the wheel on. Can't have a transmission but on a wheel. This is the wheel. Put a nut on. Screw it back to the ways. Wheel on. Second nut. Just flush with the end of the shaft there, and then spin this nut out so it's snug, and a wrench in there, second wrench, and tighten it. Okay, now it's finished, and now we can switch it on. So it is currently in high gear. Shift it to low gear. Back to high gear. In the middle here it's in neutral. And high gear again. If you look inside you can see how the shifter is moving that clutch plate. There in neutral, it's in the middle. If you go into low gear, it engages with the clutch plate on the large gear there. Or here in high gear, it engages with the small gear. Now, one important design property of this motor, you notice the motor is very small. That's so that you can't hurt yourself with this. If you actually stick your finger in here into the gears, it just stops. It's not strong enough to hurt at all, which is intentional. It also means you can stop it, quite easily this way, even in low gear. And there you go, the fully operational, fully electrified 2-speed transmission.